All right, hey, what's up, guys? We have Eddie here to talk about China. So what's going on, Eddie? How you doing today?
Hey, I'm good, Micah. How are you?
Good. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself first?
Sure, no problem. So like you said, my name is Eddie, and I run a podcast called Sinobabble. It's also a newsletter over on Substack as well. And it's essentially all about China. So the first, say, this first 4 years of the podcast were all about Chinese history. So covering mainly the 20th century, the Maoist years, um, the CCP's rise to power and things like that. And now that I've sort of finished with that period, I'm doing more general topics. So talking about Chinese news, trying to put some historical context on a lot of China's decisions, because a lot of people have questions like, oh, why would China do that with Russia or that with India or that with the US, for example? So I try and answer those questions sort of factually without trying to put any bias. I feel like there's enough bias out there in the media. So yeah, just try and do more educative content, basically.
Yeah, I feel like China has like one of the most biased countries, or at least I think like a lot of it has to do with just it seems like we don't know a whole lot about what's going on there, most people. But I'll get to that. But so yeah, how did you get into how or why did you get into China?
So my undergraduate degree many, many years ago was in Chinese studies. And I really enjoyed it. So I did a master's and then a PhD in Chinese, China and Chinese history. So Chinese language, culture, and history. I've also lived in China and I've lived in Hong Kong as well. Two very different worlds, the mainland and Hong Kong. And I started Sinobabble sort of as a project to help me read more about Chinese history, because when you're doing a PhD, you'd have to do so much reading, and there's not a lot of ways to motivate yourselves other than looking yourself in like a dark room and just staring at books all day. So it was kind of a way to motivate myself to do more reading, and sometimes the best way to learn something is to like teach other people as well.
Yeah, so as far as you mentioned the Substack thing, and I've heard like a lot about Substack. I don't really know too much about it. In terms of you being involved with Substack, is that like something like they come to you to kind of be like, hey, do you want to be? It's kind of like a newsletter type thing, right?
Yeah, no, anyone can start one. It's kind of, I don't know if you ever like saw about Medium, for example. So it's kind of like a writing outlet. It's very much focused on the content of the writing, because basically everyone's the format comes out the same. So everyone has the same font, everyone has the same like, style and setup sort of thing. So it's all about the content. But yeah, I read Substacks. There's Substacks about literally everything from like, I read really weird ones about like cultural life in China, from like young people's culture, and then I also read one about like communal living as well, just on like gardening and things like that. So yeah, there's Substacks about everything.
Okay, and so it's kind of just um like a podcast, but for writers, or like how like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, but it's for writers, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like the hosting
Yeah, a place to
platform.
go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. And do you get paid to write for Substack or no?
No,
Is
but
it
you can your subscribers can support you with donations if they want to. A lot of people, some people do that for their living.
okay? And yeah, so do you do this like full time as your job? Like you're like a like kind of like a journalist, podcaster, or
No,
do you have a full
no,
time
it's
job too?
it's totally a side project. I have a full-time job, but yeah, this is
Okay.
just something that I do on the side. It's like a hobby that I can't really let go of, even though it takes up so much time.
Because it's very, I would imagine it's very probably hard to make a living being like a journalist, right?
Yeah, I think especially now that it's so, people don't read paper newspapers anymore. Everything's digital. A lot of traditional media we're seeing struggle, like keeping up revenues and things like that. Like I think just yesterday, actually, there were a lot of layoffs in lots of different mainstream newspapers. And so I think now what you're seeing is a lot of people, a lot of journalists kind of either going freelance or trying to set up their own thing. So Substack is a really big venue for former and sort of like current freelance journalists who want to just like have their own platform and have their own audience and have their own voice instead of it being dictated by like their editor or whatever.
And it's basically through just the Substack website, essentially. Like you just, if I wanted to go read your stuff on there, I would just go to like substack.com or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can search by topic. You can search, if you know what you're looking for, you can search precisely for the newsletter, and like different newsletters can recommend other people's newsletters as well. So it's kind of like its own ecosystem where, you know, you can refer a friend or direct people to one other newsletters that you read and like as well.
Yeah. I would imagine that yeah, like with AI, like it's probably getting harder and harder too for journalists, right? Because it's like now, I mean, this is only what I've heard. Like you can just basically go into the Chat GPT or whatever and be like, write me up, like obviously it's not going to write up a story as good as like a journalist, but it's easier to be able to have the AI write the stories, I guess now, right? Like, are you using Chat GPT at all, like for your writing?
I not for my Sinobabble project, no. But it's weird for it's like a weird I don't know, mix of a tool, because while it is kind of good at giving you like really standard stuff, like, you know, tell me everything I need to know about like Mao Zedong's entire life, it could tell you it in a very standard way. But I think ChatGPT hasn't been updated to the current day. So like it can't tell you anything about the Ukraine war, for example. And it gets a lot of stuff wrong. Like it will just make up things. And then if you ask it, it will be like, oh, sorry, like I didn't know that wasn't correct. That's my mistake, sort of thing. So it's not that it lies, but it's definitely not reliable. And my full-time job is actually in academic publishing. And we're actually going through a really tough time at the moment trying to regulate scientific authors not using AI to help them write their scientific papers. And so we're now having to sort of counter innovate products that can detect AI generated text and things like that, especially a lot of people who don't speak English as a native language kind of use it as a shortcut to help them get published in highly respected scientific journals and things like that.
Yeah, people are kind of acting as if it's some sort of, crazy thing, but like what I've got on there, it hasn't been that amazing. You know what I mean? It's like, no. like you said, essentially just spits out kind of like facts you would read on like Wikipedia or whatever. It's not going to like give you like a really creative, although I've heard that, some people have gotten good at like prompting it to do that or whatever, but it's not going to be able to like just to spit out some sort of like long, creative like YouTube script that like a human would write, you know what I mean? Or like some sort of crazy investigative journalism. Yeah, but so anyways, yeah. And it's like, I don't know how far we are from that essentially, but I've heard that ChatGPT 4 is supposed to be better, and who knows. But so let's get into China though, since that's what you're here for. So yeah, I like I said before, I feel like there's a lot of like misconceptions about China. I mean, I know very little about it. And I guess the first question I'll ask would be like, in terms of its political structure, I feel like a lot of people think that it's like a communist country, but then you hear like, oh no, it's not really fully communist. It's kind of like a mix of communists and capitalists. And in some areas it may be communist, and then like, I don't know, like some areas it may not be, right? So yeah, could you go over like their political structure there?
Sure. So yeah, it is very complicated. I think one of the reasons that people get a misconception about it is because of how it's often portrayed in Western media. I think particularly if you're a US observer trying to learn about China and you're looking at it from it's often portrayed as like a dyad, like America is like the free West and China is like the repressive communist remnants. And it's all this Cold War terminology that doesn't really apply anymore. So the way China would characterize their government is something called socialism with Chinese characteristics, which basically means that China is a one-party state that is governed by the CCP. No one else can govern China because the CCP is sort of like the rightful governing body that is, designated to lead China on this glorious path, essentially. And the the way the economy is structured is essentially it is a centrally controlled market driven economy. So that means you can have things like private companies, you can have foreign investment, you can have exports and imports and things like that, but you can't, it's not free. It's not free market economy. It's not laissez-faire, as we would call it in the West. It's very much centrally driven. And the government still has control over things like budgets, where major sections of investment goes. So, for example, if the CCP decided tomorrow that, we want to develop the next AI, all of the government's sort of focus in terms of budget, in terms of policy making in terms of like land designation for people to make these AI companies, in terms of like computing power and, turning some people's internet off so that they can build the AI faster or whatever, that's still all within the central government's remit. So when you see these things, like I know people sometimes get confused about things like the Belt and Road. They think that, the CCP is like sending out all these companies, or it's the Chinese communist companies going out to these countries. And it's not quite right. It's more like the central government has given this dictate that companies should go out to foreign countries and try and set up joint ventures. And then those companies do what they can to try and fulfill that mandate, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so what is the CCP exactly? Like, what does it stand for? And
yeah, so the CC is the Chinese Communist Party. They call themselves the CPC, which is the Communist Party of China. People get very irritated if they're pro-China that if you say CCP instead of CPC. But yeah, it's the one party that governs. There are other parties in China, but the central ruling party is the CCP, headed by Xi Jinping, as everyone knows. And in China, there is a party and a government. So like most countries, you have like the political party that's been voted into power, and then you have sort of like the civil service bureaucratic side of things. And that's how, most states are set up, except for in China, to be a government official, you are, especially a top level government official, you would also be a member of the Communist Party. So even though there's sort of like a theoretical divide between the two, the government is ruled over by the party and cannot pass any laws without their approval.
Okay, so it sounds like, well, for one, they do call themselves the Communist Party of China, but for two, it sounds like it's almost like a mixture of communism, like I said, with capitalism. Like you're able to start your own business. However, they're essentially the government's able to come in and dictate whatever they want, essentially, right? Like if you're not doing things the way they want you to do them.
Absolutely. So you see this in very large companies that are privately owned. So for example, take a company like Alibaba, which a lot of people know as sort of like an online marketplace, is a little bit like Amazon, or just other large, like Tencent, that runs the Chinese equivalents of WhatsApp and Twitter. Recently, these companies have had to split up into smaller sort of subsidiary companies because the government basically deemed that they were a monopoly, but they didn't have any. It's not like they could protest against that and sort of take that to court or whatever, because it was a central party dictate. Whereas in the West, you see that, often we haul the CEOs of like Facebook or Google or Apple or whoever into court, and we tell them you should do this, and then they don't really listen. In China, you can't get away with things like not paying your taxes as a private company. And often most private companies actually have Chinese Communist Party cells within the company. So that you have a whole section of the company that's dedicated to making sure that you follow party guidance and government rules.
Okay. And as far as, so yeah, and then I've also heard that like Hong Kong, it's like in China, but it has kind of like its own rules, right? It's almost kind of like very similar to how we are, where it's like maybe more just straight capitalist, right?
Well, it was until very recently. In 2019 and 2020, the Chinese Communist Party basically passed a bunch of, well, 2 or 3 new laws in China, the extradition law and the security bill. And between these 2 laws, they essentially have changed the governance system of Hong Kong. So before 1997, Hong Kong was a British colony. Then in 1997, it was passed over back to the mainland of China under something called the One Country, Two Systems system. Essentially, Hong Kong had its own elected parliament, and it was, as you say, running its sort of free market capitalist style economy. And it was supposed to run like that for 50 years. But basically, the Chinese Communist Party has been slowly, getting more of a foothold in Hong Kong, doing things like erasing the border for immigration between Hong Kong and mainland China, letting more Chinese businesses buy land and set up business in Hong Kong. And now they've changed the way that the government runs as well, so that they're basically just pro-Beijing, pro-CCP people who are running Hong Kong. And so now you see that Hong Kong since 2020 is more and more in line with the mainland.
Okay, yeah, I had a friend who lived there, and that was a while ago. I mean, I met him in college, and he had lived there prior. So yeah, this was like 20 years ago, and he was, from what I remember, he was saying that it was similar to us. So yeah, it sounds like more recently it's changed, so they are just fully within the CCP now. Okay,
Yeah,
and then
I mean,
so
sorry, I was
Yeah.
going to add that I wouldn't
No
say
problem.
fully. I think the CCP is still trying to keep that illusion, especially so that it maintains its attractiveness to foreigners, right? Because Hong Kong is supposed to be like, we're not really China. You can still kind of like come here and do business, but I think I know Hong Kong people who have left basically because they're like, it's not the same, and it's definitely going to change. So,
But they want people to think or they want people to visit it to think that it is essentially the same as
yeah,
it was, but it's not.
yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned them. What kind of things do they do if you're not following the rules? Because I mean, I know here essentially, like if Amazon or whoever, Google, isn't following the rules, I guess mainly they'll just like find them, and then I guess there could be prison time. But like in China, you hear things about like people like kind of like disappearing and stuff like that. I forgot the guy's name, but he was kind of like a shorter guy, and I want to say he was maybe the head of Alibaba or something. And for a while,
Yeah,
he
that's
like
right. Jack Ma, yeah.
exactly for a while he disappeared. I think he's back now, right? But like,
Yeah, I think rumors abound that he lives in Japan now.
so you think that he kind of had to like run and hide type thing because he wasn't abiding by the rules, or
I mean, he was technically abiding by the rules, but he was very, very successful. He was the richest man in China for a while. But he's always been more on the liberal side in his personality and his politics and things like that. So while he's always been very law abiding, he definitely leans more to like the free capital side of things, obviously, because he's like a billionaire. So he wants things to be as free as possible so he can make more money. And just before he disappeared, he made some comments at like an economic forum or something like that about how it's getting really difficult to do business in China. He made some comments like, I keep trying to tell them, but they don't listen, sort of thing. Like they don't know what they're doing, and they being the CCP are really going to hurt business prospects in China with the way that they're running things. And then basically a week later, he disappeared for like 6 months. And there was no official story. It was just kind of like, oh, we haven't seen Jack Ma around in a while. And then it came out that, he's been dodging taxes, or he's been creating a monopoly, just like general kind of excuses. And it's typically what you would see from China, from the Chinese Communist Party, when someone steps out of line, not so much financially, but definitely ideologically. I would say that's a lot more important. They want you to at least appear to be a moral, upstanding citizen who supports the CCP as this like infallible, like the righteous rulers of China. That's, I would say, a lot more important to them than whether or not you're financially corrupt, because financial corruption, graft, backdoor trades, nepotism, all of these things are very common in China.
okay, so you think we don't really know, it sounds like, but there is a possibility that China, the CCP, like try to kind of, or maybe they were, I mean, will they, I guess, will they ever get physical in situations? Like, will they ever try and like kill someone essentially, or like do they ever like get like really extreme like that, where if you're,
I
or
mean,
what do you think happened? Like, do you think they maybe just said you got to get out of here, or like, you know?
yeah, it's, I mean, I don't think anyone's ever actually reported. I mean, I think there have been some people who have said, you know, this terrible thing happens behind closed doors and, you know, you get beaten or starved. There is a, I forget the name of it now, but there is like a tell-all book by a former high-ranking Communist Party member who defected to, I believe it was the US, and wrote this sort of tell-all. But many of the things that he said have been sort of questioned or debunked. So it's very difficult to get an account because, you know, you see it with everyone talking about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, you know, the Muslim minority of China who are supposedly being put in these re-education camps, but, you know, people are calling them like China's concentration camps. But it's very difficult to know what actually goes on. It's kind of like trying to peek behind North Korea and only listening to the words of defectors. It's like, are you just getting the worst case story? How much of this is true? You know, and the Chinese Communist Party has let like the BBC from the UK into these re-education camps in Xinjiang province, and, you know, shown all these happy smiling people learning Mandarin and learning new skills and learning how to paint and learning IT skills, but they have been locked up. You know, they can't just freely walk out if they want to. They can't just go home and visit their families anytime they want. Mosques are closing down in Xinjiang province. Lots of these people are being relocated to, you know, new work opportunities after they get out of these re-education camps. So it's like we don't have enough information. We can only assume what's going on, but then you don't want to assume too far, because if you stretch it and exaggerate it, then the CCP is very good at turning around and being like, oh, the West is always trying to demonize us. They're always lying about us. And then anything you have said that has any credibility is completely shot, because, you know, you've been like, oh, they're murdering Uyghurs, and they're like, no, we're not, we can prove, and it just becomes like a battle of words and nothing actually gets solved or understood properly.
Yeah, and there's like a big thing going on like in America right now, I feel like, where it's like, I think we're trying to be as like, you know, basically not racist as possible, which is good, you know what I mean? Like with with how Trump was acting towards when, you know, China with the COVID, when he was calling it the what was it, the China virus or
The
whatever.
China flu, yeah.
And just in general, like with the Middle East and like with Muslims, like we're trying to be as, or the left at least is trying to be as understanding as possible, and not like jumping to conclusions or being biased. But like you, and then it's also interesting too, because I just had a guy on from the French military who went into Africa because the Muslims there were going into Africa and essentially having like kids take up arms. So it's like, it's kind of interesting. And same thing with Israel and Palestine. It's like you have two groups where they're both kind of doing bad. Well, I don't really want to jump to conclusions and say the Muslims in China are doing bad. It's kind of hard for me to say what I'm saying here without coming off bad, but basically you have two groups who maybe doing bad. Like, I guess Israel and Palestine would be the perfect example, where it's like some people are like supporting Palestine, some people are supporting Israel. It sounds like they both kind of are like not doing, you know, totally good things, but it's like who do you defend? So in this situation, that would be basically the Muslims in China and then the Chinese. In this situation, were these Muslims, like, how did they even get there in the first place? Or like, were they already there and they converted to being Muslim? You know what I mean? It's kind of like,
yeah. No, it's a good question. It's got a very long, complex history. So the part of China that the people of Xinjiang belong to, or the majority Muslim population belong to, is basically bordering areas like Kazakhstan and Afghanistan. So in the northwest of China. So historically, it's a Muslim territory. They haven't always been Muslim, and a lot of them were not Muslim until like the 17th or 18th century. So in historical terms, they converted relatively recently. But that's quite common for the Middle East. The Middle East, especially the eastern part of the Middle East, hasn't been Muslim for that long. But yeah, they were there, and they have been in and out of the Chinese Empire under different regimes. So for example, when the Mongolians in the 12th and 13th century conquered, most of Asia, that's when they were first brought in, and then they were out again, and they came back in the 17th century, and then they were out again, and then they came back in the 20th century. So some of them want independence, some of them want to be part of Kazakhstan, some of them want to form a country called New Turkestan, some of them want to be Chinese, but they want more opportunities. So it's a complex social situation. There has been some terrorism, and the CCP sort of jumped on 9/11 as a way to be like, oh, we can clamp down on Muslims because Muslims are dangerous, sort of thing. And they sort of took that narrative and used it to suppress Muslim populations more harshly. And then in 2008, there were a few terrorist attacks in China that were led by Muslim extremists. So there's been a bit of back and forth, but obviously the majority of that population is very peaceful. And what the CCP would argue that they're doing is trying to give them opportunities, because it's a very it's one of the poorest regions. So they're saying, well, we're just going in, we're trying to give these people we're trying to encourage them to intermarry with Chinese people, with Han Chinese people, the native Chinese people. We're trying to encourage them to learn Mandarin so that they can get better jobs, so that they can develop economically, and so that they can better integrate with the rest of the country, right? So for them, it's like, this is our assimilation policy. You don't have any right to judge us. Whereas the Muslim population would be like, we are being spied on. We are being prevented from practicing our religion. We are being prevented from, marrying freely or like moving freely. So it's, as you say, there are two sides to the story, and people are very comfortable, I find, picking a side. It's like, well, I think the CCP is right. It's like, well, I feel bad for the Uyghurs, but I don't think it's as straightforward as with most of these situations. It's very, very complex, and it often comes down to what individuals themselves want as well.
Yeah, and like you said, it's just so hard to find out what's really going on, because I think it's true that like China doesn't really allow people to go visit there for the most part, right? Like I can't just go to China, right? It sounds like you have been to China, but it's probably a process to get in, right?
Yeah, you need a visa to get to China. I would say well, I'm not sure now what their COVID policies are, but visiting China generally is quite easy. I would say traveling around China can be quite difficult because their English isn't that great still. So especially in the interior part of China, going anywhere westwards would be hard. And then going anywhere restricted, so places like Xinjiang, anything even close to Tibet, you need like special permission, you need special licenses, special tour guides. You wouldn't be allowed to wander around by yourself, for sure.
Why is that? Why are there certain places more restricted than others?
So it just basically depends on the level of international political interest. So somewhere like Tibet obviously has its freedom movement. The Dalai Lama lives abroad. There's, the CCP has appointed their own Dalai Lama. There was, that huge period in the noughties, I believe, where you had all of these Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire in protest of the Chinese regime. So they see themselves as a people's conquered that should be independent and have their own independence. And China is like, no, you're part of China. Basically, you are Chinese people. And again, is putting them through these assimilation programs where they have to learn Mandarin in school. Their children go to boarding schools and they're not at home, not in their communities. They've moved from like their villages into these new modern housing developments and made to get new jobs. So again, it's that contrast of Tibetan people would argue that they're trying to maintain their way of life, and Chinese people would be like, well, you have to modernize, and that's just the way it is. So it's you can go to Tibet, but it's not as straightforward as just, you can't just like book a flight and go to Lhasa, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So for some reason, I thought that I wouldn't even be able to go, but it sounds like you can go, but it's very restricted on where you go. So
Yeah.
hmm, okay. I'm surprised more people aren't going over there. It just seems like such like a hidden place that we don't know too much about. But so I mean, there's a lot that I want to cover here, but so I guess we'll start off with the religion. So within China, they have these Buddhist monks that are setting themselves on fire, right? And I mean, are they just totally doing that as martyrs? Like, are they dying from that, or like,
Yes, yes.
so
So
they're
when
just
I don't
completely
think
being
there's been a
martyrs?
case for a long time, but yes, it's in protest, and I believe it's a form of martyrdom. Although I'm not 100%, but yeah, I believe that's what it's for.
Okay, so for whatever reason, stupidly, I think that like I think I saw like the Rage Against the I don't know if you've seen the Rage Against the Machine cover, which is like a monk setting
Yeah,
himself
yeah,
on
yeah.
fire. And I kind of thought for some reason it was some sort of like Buddhist, like kind of like I don't
Like a
even really know what
ritual
I
or
thought. Like
something.
a ritual, or how like the monks will like they'll be so like focused that they'll be able to like levitate or whatever. And I was
Yeah.
like, I thought they like he was setting himself on fire, but like he was still fine type thing or whatever.
Oh,
But
yeah,
so
yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's it's obviously, yeah, it's in protest. Uh, Um and so what is the religion? So within China, there's these Buddhist monks, or
Mhm.
these Buddhist people essentially, but then you have China. What religion does China want their people to be, or is it just not religious at all?
China is deliberately atheist, I would say. So they have
Oh, okay.
ancient folk religions, Taoism, sometimes called Taoism as well, Confucianism, and also large parts of China were actually Buddhist. Like that's a very common religion in China, in Japan as well, and in Korea. You've got small pockets of Christians as well who were converted during like the late 19th, early 20th century, when there were lots of foreign invasions in China. Um, but China, the CCP is communist, and Marx once said that religion is the opiate of the masses. So it's actually anti-communist to be religious, essentially. And under Mao Zedong's regime, he made concerted efforts. There were several campaigns to stamp out religion, including the Cultural Revolution, which was sort of China's big 10-year experiment that went slightly wrong, where anything religious at all, even if it was like a Chinese cultural relic, I think 3/4 of all Chinese like cultural heritage was destroyed in the 1970s under the Cultural Revolution. So any, like Confucian statues, Taoist temples, any, Buddhist relics, anything like that were just like completely destroyed under the communists.
Okay, and yeah, like for me, like I never really understood, and it's I do understand it. It's for control or whatever, but it's like I've really never understood like why the government cares about what religion you are. Like you said, they say that it's the opiate for the masses, but it's like, I mean, does it really matter? Like it's like it's like with the Muslims too, how they're treating them. Like I was gonna say, like I just don't really, if they do have them in concentration camps, or what happened like in Nazi Germany. Like I've never understood why you would want somebody in a concentration camp because of their religion. You know what I mean? It's like,
Mm.
okay, it's like who cares? And it's like I don't think the religion is really necessarily, from what I know, it's like here in America, you can be whatever religion you want. And like none of the religions are really like pushing back on the government for the most part, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's just like I don't get why these countries are still wanting to have this like iron grip over their people. Like it just,
Mm.
and it's I mean, I think I know why. It's obviously for control, and it's obviously they want everybody under their particular regime and to believe the same thing. But it just seems like, I don't know. It just seems like if you have enough angry people, like your country's just not going to do well. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think so. I think from a personal perspective, it's not too clear, but I think from the Chinese Communist perspective, it's very clear um, from an ideological level why you can't have religion. It's completely antithetical to communism, because communism essentially requires the submission of the self, right? So like you can't really have personal desire under communism. You can't really have your own thought. You can't have really your own goals. Your goals, your thoughts, your wants, your desires all have to be aligned with whatever the state wants, because you're trying to build this equal communist utopia whereby we're all prosperous. And in order for all of us to be prosperous, you can't have some people who are more prosperous than others. That doesn't work. This is at a theoretical level. It doesn't actually apply to China, but this is how, when the Chinese Communist Party was being formed, when they took over, and even now, even though they've moved to a more market capitalist economy, that ideology of everyone moving in lockstep to build whatever the CCP's vision is, you can't have things like religion interfering with that, because you need people to believe in you. You need people to believe in your way of doing things and your way of thinking. If I think of the US and I was trying to think of an example, it would probably be economic. So in terms of the economy, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the biggest debates that you guys have is about healthcare, right? So like, should healthcare be more affordable, or should it be free like it is at the point of view, say in Europe or something like that? Or should it still be like pay per use, and then based on your insurance, whether you pay for that yourself or you get that through work? And that's a huge topic of debate. And from a European perspective, that doesn't make any sense, right? So we're looking at you guys and we're like, well, obviously you just have it for free and then it's paid for through taxes. But then Americans, in generally speaking, are against any rise in taxes. And it's like, that's an ideological argument. It's not actually economic. And it's something that's been imbued in Americans since like the founding of the country, right? The idea of the freedom of the individual, and like you are personal responsibility. You're responsible unto yourself. You shouldn't, burden your neighbor, and you should be trying to, like work towards your own version of the American dream. Whereas in China, you've kind of got the opposite, which is why China and the US clash so much. It's because China, the CCP, wants the entire country to be oriented towards its own goals. Whereas in the US, it's a lot more, the ideology is to be the fragmented individual self.
Yeah, I totally get it. It's just like with the religion thing, it just, it goes back to the, like, people are going to have their wants, like you mentioned, the wants and desires. And it's like, people are going to have their wants and their desires, whether they're religious or not, you know what I mean? And it's like,
but it's also about devotion. Like, you can't be devoted to God and the CCP at the same time. And if you are devoted to God,
I feel like you can, though. That's the thing. Like, I feel like but
they have to share, and that's not okay.
No, yeah, I get that, but it's like, if you're like a Christian or whatever in America, it's like you can be devoted to God, but then to be devoted to your family and then be devoted to your business. There's plenty of people who are, God, guns, and country or whatever. But like,
yeah,
it's like, I mean, if anything, it just seems kind of like, okay, this person's religious. Well, at least they're going to like, at least try to follow these, religious rules, which may or may not be good. But yeah. Anyways, like, so moving on to the communist aspect of it. So, as like here in America, like I was saying before, like I think we're very biased towards China, Russia, really any communist country. And I had a guy on who was trying to he was talking about communism. He's for communism, and it's like, to be honest with you, like I'm for communism, but like it has to work. And it sounds like from what we're taught, at least here in America, that it doesn't. A lot of Republicans will say it just doesn't work or whatever. But it's like, I guess my question to you would be like, do you think it works? Like, do you think that ultimately China is trying to do good for the people? And also, I asked this guy who was communist, like, would you want to live? That's the big question, is like, would you rather live in America or would you rather live in these communist countries such as, and it's so convoluted to like which ones are actually communist. Like Russia isn't communist anymore. I think Cuba is, right? I think like China is kind of. but yeah, and then there's also the question, and this is kind of a long way of asking, but I wanted to like cover both these points. Also, you hear about like the Apple sending their, Apple having Foxconn over there or whatever, and like those people working for like, slave wages, and then child almost slavery over there or whatever, or like children working. But then also you hear about the Congo, which I heard on Joe Rogan recently. I don't know if you know about that, but the guy went on and he went to the Congo and was saying how basically because we're using iPhones, kids in the Congo are essentially like slaves or whatever. But then it's like he was saying that it sounds like China kind of overall controls that. So
I think they own the majority of the mines. Yeah.
And so America kind of, I think, is, even though we're totally involved with that, like we're kind of like washing our hands, saying, oh well, China owns the mines or whatever, and we're just getting our batteries or whatever from there. But so yeah, overall, and I kind of like almost do want like a personal answer from you, like, do you think that overall they're trying to do the best thing? Do you think that overall communism is working for them? Or do you think that like a lot of the Americans are right when they say like it's not good? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I totally do. From a personal perspective, I don't personally believe that communism can work at scale, because like every ideology, except for free market capitalism, I find, if you can call that an ideology, it's more of an economic system. Communism doesn't factor in people, like how people actually think and work and live and want. It kind of, it assumes a system, this perfect system would work if it was run by like colony ants, basically, who would just mindlessly do the tasks that they were given, would be happy to earn the same work as everyone else, earn the same amount of money as everyone else, regardless of the amount of work that they did, right? Because the fundamental philosophy of communism is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So that means that if you as an able-bodied man were, say, lifting heavy, in a pre-industrial age, lifting heavy steel bars all day long, but a disabled person wasn't working at all, you would both get the same standard of living, the same food rations, the same healthcare provision, everything, regardless of how hard you worked. So for me, I just think it's impractical, because especially on a large scale. I think in a small society, I mean, on a family level, it works, right? Because like if you've got parents and kids, the parents work and the kids don't, but everyone lives in the same house, everyone eats the same food, everyone gets the same healthcare, etc. You can possibly pull it off in a town. Once you get to a city level, it's like every man for themselves. If you've been to anywhere, any major city, like New York or whatever, it is people don't care about other people, and you can't, because you're removed from them socially. So I think what communist countries often try to do, you see this in China as well, they try to foster a sense of like social community. When the Chinese Communist Party were building their early cities, they would build something called residence committees into them, where it's like people who are basically in charge of making sure everyone in the building's okay, all the old people are taken care of, all the women have play groups to take their kids to, all the men work in the same factory, so like everyone in your building would go to the same office with you, basically, and all your kids went to the same school and you all had the same doctor. So they worked really hard on fostering that sense of local community, because they knew that that's the best way to get communism to work. But it still doesn't factor in, some people didn't want to be a factory worker, some people wanted to go to university. And then you have this other layer within communism where it's like the way communism works is on a timeline, right? So you have to have reached capitalism before you reach communism, because communism is the reallocation of capital goods to everyone up on an equal distribution. So you're taking away from the rich capitalists and you're giving it to the poor people. So you have disempowered and disenchanted a large chunk of your population already, and you've possibly had to execute them like they did in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. You might have had to execute them or turn them into like semi-slaves out in the wilderness, or in China, maybe they ran away to places like Taiwan and Hong Kong, or put them in prison or labor camps or whatever. So you've already got a disenchanted part of the population who wanted better, who aspired to better, but you've stripped that away from them. So you've kind of built this social disharmony, and then they've got this awful label attached to them, like, you used to be a capitalist, you're an awful person, and now all your children are the children of capitalists, and they're awful people, and they can never have opportunities, they can never go to university, and they can never be anything more than like a basic farmer, basically. So you have to basically forcibly level out society when society is already like fractured and people are already at different levels. So that's a really long way of answering the question of, no, I don't think communism can work. But when it comes to what China is trying to do, I think they're like every other country. They're just trying to survive. It's a very competitive world out there. China's doing it its own way. I mean, is it doing a good thing or a bad thing? Is the US doing a good thing or a bad thing? Is the UK doing a good thing or a bad thing? You know, every country has its, you know, points, its good points and its bad points. It's like neo-colonialism, and it's like aid programs, it's wars on people who are just trying to live their lives, and you know, like, you know, it's charities and things like that. So I think China is just another country, and it shouldn't be sort of, the problem is that it's often portrayed as this like boogeyman who's out to get the US. And it's like, I don't think that's really the case. I think they're just doing what they can.
Yeah. And in terms of that, well, let's just stay with I just have a question real quick on that. In terms of that, like, so we supposedly owe them, you know, you hear like all these numbers thrown, like we're in debt to China, like 13 trillion or whatever, like that type of thing. So is that correct? Like we are in debt to them somewhere along the lines of 13 trillion or whatever the number is, like, do you know if that's correct?
Yeah.
Roughly. Yeah. So in terms of that, like, and then you also hear, like you said, like they're the big boogeyman, and it's like, I guess, like, at what point, do you think that they actually might just be like, fuck this, like we're cutting America off? And I've heard, but the reason like why they don't is because I think they need us, essentially, right? They need us for like
Yeah.
what do you call it? For like kind of like shipping back and forth. I don't know why.
Yeah,
why
export,
actually? Why
export trade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
The US, I believe, I could be wrong, but it's definitely in the top 3 of China's largest export markets.
okay, and export meaning like we're buying a lot of stuff from Alibaba or whatever,
yeah.
right? And then we get a lot of
so
stuff from them, but then they also get a lot of stuff from
Yeah.
us. Okay.
Yeah, so like it's like something like every single iron in the world is made in China, or like 99% of irons in the world are made in China. Anything you're using right now, like your headset, your computer, whatever, it's either been wholly manufactured or a part of it has been made in China for a company to sell as the merchandiser in the US. You know, this is why a few years ago lots of makeup companies were getting in trouble, because you had really high-end brands and really low-end cheap drugstore brands all getting their makeup made in exactly the same factory in China, and just having a different label slapped on it and then shipped out to the consumer with a different price. But yeah, all of that, like a lot of that, I wouldn't say all of it, because America does still have, I think Americans underestimate how much manufacturing is still you know, homegrown, especially things like the automotive industry and things like that. And driving being like one of the largest employment sectors, is very important. But China does have quite a big grasp on things like steel, consumer goods, and increasingly semiconductors, which are like really important chips that go in like phones and electric vehicles and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, so to a certain extent, like with that, and I kind of want to stay on the whole communist thing, but like, and not only that, but like their work conditions and stuff like that. But like, so with that being said, like, do you think that, like, for one, we're kind of taking advantage of the fact that they're making like really cheap goods, and then two, their government is taking advantage of their own people essentially to make these goods? And then also, is it with that being said, is it true that there are people out there who are making, very extremely low wages to make things such as the iPhones and whatever else that they're making for extremely cheap?
Yeah.
Like
I think
like you're
for
saying, it's like the problem that I have is I don't really have a problem with the fact that they're communists, because in a way I totally I agree with the communist ideals. But it's like, it also sounds like, okay, if you're communist, then shouldn't everybody have the same? I think technically you said they say they're socialist, right? But like,
yes.
shouldn't they all have, like, it's not fair that they're having slave wages when they're supposed to be communist, which is supposed to make everyone equal, right?
Yeah. So I think there's a little bit of nuance perhaps to the way that things like wages and stuff are construed, and conditions as well. There have definitely been things like suicides at factories because of living conditions. But I think what's acceptable for a Chinese person, considering that the country was dirt poor, like the majority of people lived in, like 90% of the people worked in agriculture, like with their bare hands about 70 years ago. To come as far in terms of industrialization and urbanization as China has now is nothing short of a miracle, both by China standards and international standards. And certainly compared to the average US worker in a factory, say like in an Amazon shipping facility or something like that, compared to a Chinese person who packages, like, I don't know, as you say, iPhones or something like that all day, or like puts them together. So a lot of Chinese people work as like immigrant labor as well. So they don't work in their hometown. They commute maybe thousands of miles from their home village, and they live in dormitories with like 10 other people in a room, and they work on the factory floor all day. But China does have strict labor laws in terms of working hours, and they do not earn as much as the average, anywhere. But also their cost of living is a lot lower. And for a lot of those people, they see this as a huge opportunity. They would much rather leave their families the whole year round, only go home once or twice a year, earn relatively a lot of money, and then go back to their village and bring back, gifts, be able to develop their villages back home, look after their children and the old people who live there. From their perspective, that's a huge opportunity. So I think there's especially from a Western point of view, there's a perspective issue, because for us that would be basically slavery, right? We're used to things like work from home, freedom to do whatever you want, just getting a Starbucks, for example, whenever you feel like it, or a McDonald's. But that's not the case in China. Life is a lot harder for the average person. But if when you speak to people, like I've spoken to people like taxi drivers, or wage workers, people who work in restaurants and things like that, they're very happy, and they see their life as an opportunity, because they are living better than the generation before. They have opportunities that they've never even seen before. They might not have aspirations to like travel abroad, go on extravagant holidays, but they're happy that they can, have an iPhone, for example. Like they have phones too, and they can browse on the internet, and they've got a good job, and they've got a roof over their head. So yeah, they have a different perspective on life, I would say, than especially the average Westerner especially would have.
So it sounds like, even though they are, well, first of all, you hear things about like child, I want to say slavery, but that's not the right term. Like child, what's it called when they make
like child labor?
Child labor, exactly. So you hear things about child labor happening there. Is that true? Like, are they?
I don't
do they
know
have
if
rules
it's
against
true
that?
or not, but they have very strict rules about like it would be unusual, I think, and that would have been exposed, I think, if they had children working in factories, because a lot of these factories as well, they're exporting to foreign companies, and so foreign business owners will go there and visit the factory and sort of make sure everything is, top shape and things like that. And they have strict rules about education in China. All children have to be in school till 14. So I think it would be rare and unusual to have like enforced child labor, perhaps in like a remote village where there's little enforcement or something like that, but definitely not in like a main city in like a factory or something like that.
Okay. Am I right though that I feel like I have heard that China does have that or is that
I
just
think
not a thing?
people have said that, yeah, but I think especially in
Yeah.
recent years, that's not really something that you would see anymore.
Okay. So it sounds like even though there are kind of like bad conditions there and like them getting paid very low wages, it's also inexpensive to live. And then also compared to how it was 50 years ago, it's gotten a lot better. So you think like
Yes.
ultimately their government is kind of like, even though there still are bad situations, they're still kind of doing the right thing. And you kind of mentioned also here in America, because I mean, I'm a big advocate for like, fair working conditions and all that. Like I've worked in an Amazon warehouse. I currently am an Amazon delivery driver, and it's like some of the stuff they do, in my opinion, is just kind of like a lot of companies just take advantage of their workers, and it's like
Yeah.
it's not okay in my mind. Like
Yeah.
I try to I'm not really actively doing anything to fight against it, but I want to. I'm for unions and all that. But it sounds like what you were saying, working here, even like in an Amazon fulfillment center or whatever, is still a lot better than working there at like Foxconn or whatever. Like it sounds like it still is a lot better in America
Mhm.
in terms of
I
work
would,
conditions, right?
yeah,
Than it
I would
is there.
say especially from an American perspective. I mean, I think something that people forget as well, possibly because of the way it's portrayed in the media, is that China's still a developing country. And they say that themselves. They don't claim to be like a fully prosperous country. Their GDP per capita is nowhere near like a developed country. I think it's still like 12,000 US dollars per person is the average like per capita GDP. In a Western
What does
country,
that mean exactly? Like GDP? Like
so like so how much a worker is worth essentially. So like how much the average person would take home a year in US dollars in China would be something, an average would be like 12,000 US dollars, which is not enough to live on from a Western perspective, right? In Western countries, the average is closer to like 30, probably kicking up to 40 these days because of inflation. So, and as you've rightly pointed out, their cost of living is a lot lower. The cost of goods is a lot cheaper, but also the quality is cheaper as well. They do have things like high speed rail links and things like that, but it's not everywhere. Most of the country is still relative, what we would consider rustic, I think, in the West. So yeah, I think there's just that, the way that China is portrayed as this, again, big bad bully with a huge military and like really imposing and like stomping on its little neighbors. China itself is still a developing country, by every sort of measure that you could measure it by. So I think it's something to bear in mind when we talk about things like conditions for living, for working. It's not what we're used to, but if you put it in the perspective of the fact that it's still developing, then I think it becomes clear as to why it is the way that it is.
yeah, it's kind of interesting that they're still developing, yet we owe them 13 trillion. You know what I mean? And then
Yeah.
also like it's yeah, it's it almost seems like, and then also in terms of, well, yeah, real quick, and so in terms of their communist beliefs, you mentioned Marx. Like, so do they have, so they get their communist beliefs from Karl Marx, right? Like they have the same.
At a basic level, yeah.
Yeah, and where's Karl Marx from? Was he Russian, or I don't even know where he's from?
No, he is. Oh, I want to say German, but he could be Austrian.
Yeah, for some reason
European.
I was thinking like Russian, just because Russia obviously was a communist country, but then I was thinking if it's not Russia, then Germany or Austria. But it's kind of
Yeah.
interesting that Russia kind of got their beliefs from Karl Marx, who came from Germany or Austria, right? It's like, yeah, for some reason I would think that like they would, I don't know, get their beliefs from somebody like within their own country, kind of thing. But
It's just the spread of ideas, isn't it? It's like ideas how does religion spread around the world? It's just transmission through people. It's a bit like a virus, really.
yeah, yeah. So basically, in terms of their communist beliefs, it is very similar to like how Russia was, right? With what's that called? I'm blanking on the Russian what Russia
Like
was before.
Stalinism, Leninism during the Soviet Union.
exactly, the Soviet Union. So it's very similar in their belief system to how the Soviet Union was then, right? Except
I
it's
think
more. It sounds like it's more capitalist now. But no,
yeah, so
yeah,
they managed to take a different road to the Soviet Union by not collapsing in the 90s. It was a close call, but they managed to sort of hold on to that. It's basically the Communist Party managed to hold on to power. The way that they do that is basically communism in China is kind of like a compounding ideology. So it's kind of like, you know, how the American Constitution has amendments. Chinese communism has amendments depending on who's in power. So like you have Mao Zedong thought, which is like the original, but it's in its full form, it's called Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. So it's a mix of Marxism, a mix of Leninism, and a mix of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was a huge fan of Stalin and Stalinism. So you've got lots of Stalinism mixed into that. When Mao Zedong dies, a man called Deng Xiaoping takes over. He is a huge market economy reformer. He introduces the idea of like fair pay for labor, basically, which wasn't a thing under Mao Zedong. People were basically just paid stagnant wages. But, you know, he introduced like a more competitive economy, especially in rural areas. And then later rulers introduce things like a slightly more open political system, and now you've got Xi Jinping thought on top of that. So basically every leader in China adds their own thought, their own ideology, their own principles for how they believe China should be run, to the big communist mix. So that's why it's not really a purist communist ideology or a pure communist country anymore, because it has all of these different philosophies mixed in there based on like where China is in its development stage.
okay. And in terms of Xing, it's I'm gonna have a hard time pronouncing that, but Xi Jinping, Xi
Xi Jinping.
Jinping, Xi
Yeah.
Jinping. Do you feel? I don't really. It sounds like everyone kind of knows he's in charge there, but I don't. I don't think I knew that, sadly. But do you think that he's overall doing a good job? Do you think he has good intentions? What do you feel about
Um,
him?
it depends on what you mean about his intentions. I think his intention, his realization is to accrue as much power to himself as possible. He's much more a supreme leader in the vein of like Mao. You know, sort of he's got like a cult of personality going on. He's a very, very like very powerful individual. So before in China, for the past few decades, you've had leaders who led as a group, so with other top members of the party, shared ideas, were a bit more consultative. But now Xi Jinping is very much like the ultimate power holder, and it's kind of construed as this guy who can like, you know, will anything that he wants into existence, basically. And his ideology is a lot stricter as well. He's not for political reform at all. He is also responsible for encouraging and increasing enmity with the US, I would say, and sort of provoking them by saying certain things about Taiwan or about Russia. But at the same time, he's trying to portray China as this very like, you know, China used to be called the like peaceful rise in the East, and I think he's trying to go back to that. Recently, China brokered a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Not a peace deal, but kind of like peace talks between them. They're now trying to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia, and Xi Jinping recently called up Vladimir Zelensky to, you know, get things moving, and he visited Moscow recently as well. So, you know, China is basically trying to show that it can be relied on, especially if the US were to collapse for whatever reason. They want to be the next big player. They want to be respected. They want to have as much soft power and hard power as the US, essentially, so that they can become the next global superpower.
And do you think they want that? Like, do you think there's any truth to them wanting the US to collapse?
Oh,
and then take over?
that's you can take that for granted for sure. Like it's in basically the textbooks in school. They'll write there's I remember reading a textbook for like a politics student, a Chinese politics student, 14, 15-year-old kid. And the text was basically given an example of, I've forgotten what it's called now, but basically where the passing of a law in the US can be held up by someone just standing there, basically, and talking and talking and talking and refusing to move. And then that can delay a bill long enough so that no one can vote on it. I forgot what it's called now.
Yeah, it's called yeah, I know what you're talking about, but
Yeah.
I'm forgetting
It's on the
what
tip
it's
of my
called too.
tongue. People will be
Yeah,
screaming at us listening, but
yeah.
they use things
A
like that.
filibuster?
Filibustering, that's
Filibuster.
it.
Yeah.
And they use things like that as an example of why the US system is like completely broken and about to collapse, because they've got this two-party system. They can't get anything done, and because of this two-party system, they're always arguing about basic things like healthcare, like abortion. And because the government can't make a decision, then the people can't get anything done, basically, and the people are suffering. Whereas in China, because we have just one party, everything's like smooth, life is great, everyone's prospering, everyone's getting richer, life is getting better. So they deliberately contrast the US system to the Chinese one to show why democracy, especially sort of US federalism style republicanism democracy, doesn't work.
So do you think there's any truth to them using like stuff like TikTok to kind of like be divisive and try and I guess like, you know, mess with us internally from the outside? I mean, from my perspective of that kind of thing, it's just like when they were saying the same thing about Russia with the Russian collusion or whatever. Like it doesn't, I don't know, it like just doesn't. First of all, I've been on TikTok a lot and it doesn't really seem like, you know, if they are trying to do that, it doesn't seem like they're doing a good job at it. You know what I mean? Like it.
Yeah,
and I mean,
exactly.
it's like sad to say, and it's probably really ignorant on my part, but it's just like I don't really feel like them or Russia are like really. It's like really sad to say, but like intelligent enough to mess with us in that kind of way. And it's like if they are, and I'm saying that being on these apps, you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
I don't know if you've been on TikTok, but most of it's just like from what I've seen at least is extremely goofy. It's not like any type of
Yeah.
like hardcore communist like speeches or anything. But yeah, so do you think there's any truth to them trying to kind of like what's the word? I guess like trying like be divisive and get us to like fight with each other from the outside?
Honestly, I don't think they would even have to try. I think the US is so easy to provoke right now. Like you saw with the spy balloon incident, like that was nothing. And it could very easily have been dismissed by the US as just nothing. Don't worry about that, guys. We're going to handle it. It's not a big deal. But instead, it was blown completely out of proportion. And in many ways, the US mishandled it and embarrassed themselves. China didn't even have to do anything. All China said was like, it's just a balloon, you know, like we're not doing anything. It's just a balloon. And so China, I don't think China is trying to like, it's not really trying to provoke the US, but at the same time, I think they have the understanding that they don't need to. China's existence is provocation to the US. And so what the US has unfortunately done is that they've put the ball in China's court, because it's like, oh, you know, TikTok is like espionage and you're stealing our data, and like explain yourself, Chinese CEO guy. And the guy's like, I'm from Singapore, I'm not even Chinese, like it's not spyware, I don't know what I don't know what you want from me. They keep hitting these balls into China's court, and China just deflects them like, no, it's not true, don't know what you're talking about. And it just enrages the US political and media machine more and more. And then that's something that China uses and points to, like, see, they're always demonizing us. They're always calling us names. They're always trying to attack us. We've done nothing wrong. So from China's perspective, it's actually a good thing that the US is so easy to provoke at the moment.
It's almost like a passive aggressive approach to like politics or something. Like we're just gonna like
yeah, they're very
passive
aggressive.
Yeah,
China is very, very passive aggressive.
Yeah, like we're just going to allow you to fight with each other from within, and we're just going to stand back and watch, and like we're happy with it. And
Yeah.
so in
Literally
terms
like
of
taking a video of it and then posting it online and like, haha, look at these guys.
and laughing, yeah. And so in terms of the spy balloon, like it's like I see so much of stuff in the news, but you don't really know fully what's going on. And it's like, if it was a spy balloon, like it didn't look like a very good spy balloon, like it was a giant, like it's just like, what the hell is this? Like, what the hell was going on with that? Like, was it an actual
Yeah.
spy balloon or what was it?
I don't think we'll ever know the truth. I think I agree with you. Like if it's a spy balloon, it was a terrible one, but then maybe, you know, like the best disguise is no disguise at all sort of thing. Like, you know, it could well be that. I don't, if it was them trying to spy on the US, it was a huge mistake. But then again, it could have been them just trying to provoke. It could have been that their narrative of it just blowing off course was correct. Like, we don't know, and we probably won't ever know the truth because everyone's bickering and, you know, can you trust what the CCP says about what China's really up to and things like that, because they lie about certain things. So it's like, I think the most important thing about the spy balloon incident is that it doesn't matter at all and it doesn't change anything. But the US let it get to them, and that revealed their hand almost, and that's something that China can now run with going forward.
I don't know. It just seems almost like child's play or something. It's like, what the hell are they doing? And it's just like, not so much China, but us. It's like, why are we like, why don't they just come out and say what it really, like, it just seems weird to me that it's like nobody really seems to know what it is, but it's like, why don't you just come out and say what it is? Like, why are you making this big deal that it's a Chinese spy balloon? It's just like, it's very weird how they're handling things. And same thing like with, it's kind of, well, it's off the topic, but it's also kind of similar to the spy balloon with the alien stuff that's, you know, the UFOs or whatever. I don't know if you've heard about this, but it's like there's all this UFO stuff, and it's like there's got to be a way for them to like know what's going on. And like if they don't, I don't know. I guess the biggest thing that I would say is like it just seems like there really is so much misinformation, and it's like maybe it just truly is misinformation, and maybe like they themselves don't really know what's going on themselves, and like they just try and spin it in a certain way, and then like meanwhile like we're all fighting against, you know, like weird like kind of like culture war issues like trans rights and like homosexuals and like abortion, which is all important, but it just, I don't know, it just seems like, you know, they've said that like we're you know, like I don't know, like people will say like the government, like, you know, they're trying to distract us with, or like the media or whatever is trying to distract us with certain stuff when like real other stuff is going on. Like there's real issues out there, and it seems like we're getting distracted, like you're saying, and they're sitting back and laughing. So yeah, I know we don't have too much more time. If we could kind of go over like a rapid fire thing real quick, because I have a ton of questions, but like you mentioned Taiwan, so I kind of want to know real quick what's going on with Taiwan. And so yeah, where is Taiwan? Like, what is it actually in China? And they're trying to separate. What's going on with that?
So Taiwan is an island chain, an island region off the east coast of China. It's not very far from the mainland. And historically it has been part of the Chinese empire, not that recent, like from the 17th century, basically. So not that recently. It's not like it's always been part of China. But during the 19th century, it was part of the Japanese Empire. And then during the Chinese Civil War, which was a war between the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party, the Communists obviously won. And the Nationalist Party fled to Taiwan, and they took over Taiwan. So now you have an ethnically Chinese, but Nationalist Party government. They're not nationalists anymore, but they're like the remnants of those people ruling over Taiwan. And China basically argues that Taiwan is a rogue state that actually belongs to the mainland. And they have something called the One China principle. The US also maintains this principle. I think a lot of people get this wrong. A lot of people think that the US unilaterally supports Taiwan and believes that Taiwan is the real China because that's what they claim. Or have claimed in the past. Now Taiwan is complaining that they are not China at all. They are their own people. But essentially the US's policy towards Taiwan is that if China invades forcibly, they will come to Taiwan's aid to protect them. If Taiwan tries to secede and say that and separate completely from China, they will not support Taiwan.
Who said that?
So this is the American policy on Taiwan.
Okay, so if Taiwan goes with the flow with China, we'll protect them. But if they try to secede, we won't.
No.
Or
So
the
so
opposite?
it's very it's weird. It's a weird policy. So basically, if mainland China invades, the US is promised to protect them. If Taiwan declares itself part of China, the US does nothing. If Taiwan declares its independence from China, the US technically cannot support that. That's the policy.
And who comes up with these rules with what the US can do or cannot do? And then also if we go to defend Taiwan, do you feel like it's like for the best interest of them, like we're kind of doing like a good charitable thing, or do you think that there's a reason why we want to do it also, like that benefits us?
Well, there is a main reason why the US doesn't want Taiwan to fall into Chinese communist hands, and that's because Taiwan produces something like 70% of the world's semiconductors. So they basically control the chip technology for every advanced technological device in the world, including electric vehicles, computers, mobile phones, like everything, TVs, everything. And so if they lose Taiwan, I say they, Taiwan is obviously like an American affiliate, if you will, then China basically has control over the entire basically technological processing industry globally. And they get to control all of those supply chains. But I don't think it would be charitable of the US to protect Taiwan. I actually did a podcast on my own channel recently about this, but essentially it would mean World War III and we would all possibly die. So I don't think it's a very good idea, because that would mean a land war between China and the US. And that's going to end badly for, like, definitely people in East Asia would perish. And the rest of us would be rocked very hard by supply chain issues. Like, you think that the Russia-Ukraine war led to inflation abroad. If China and the US go to war, that's it, basically, for most of us. And these are two nuclear superpowers as well.
And do you feel like the main reason why China doesn't want to go to war with us at this point is because, like, simply because they don't want to do that? They don't want to like completely ruin the world.
Yeah, they have no reason. I think China believes that they can bring Taiwan back into the fold basically by co-opting their economy and by interfering in their elections and trying to indoctrinate younger people to believe that they are Chinese. I think they're working on different methods. And I think they're going to wait till the US's guard is down and probably do a very small invasion far in the future, like past the 10-year mark. Basically, they're going to look for a gap or a weakness or something where the US is distracted and then make their move. I don't think they would ever declare war on the US. I don't think that would happen at all.
Well, what do you think? What does Taiwan want that's different than China? Like, do they want to become capitalist? Is it like a religion thing? Like, why do they want to secede?
So Taiwan, they've already been like a capitalist economy. They were a dictatorship for a long time. They've recently become a democracy in the last, like, I think 40 or 30 or 40-ish years. They're now a democracy. Like I say, they're very closely affiliated with the US. They run a free market economy there. There are parts of the community who want to be Chinese, who believe that either they should return to the mainland or they should work together with China more closely, but keep their independence. There are some people who believe that Taiwan should become its own nation and have nothing to do with China, that Taiwan doesn't have anything to do with China, really, except for some past historical nonsense that they should move on from. So it's, again, the community is very fractured within Taiwan. And I think that's also something that the CCP in China wants to kind of utilize to their own advantage.
Okay. And Taiwan is like pretty small too. So if they were to get into a war with China, like, they don't really have a chance, except if we go, right?
Oh, no,
Isn't Taiwan pretty small?
Yeah, it's a proxy war for sure. If China invades Taiwan and the US isn't there on the first day, they win. Like that's how it plays out.
Yeah,
Taiwan
yeah,
cannot defend
yeah.
itself at all on any level, from not from the Chinese military. No way.
Yeah. And then, I mean, like, do you think there's like any possibility of like, it seems like with all these wars going on and these spats and these battles and stuff, I mean, like, don't you think that we could all just kind of like get along and like be happy? Or like, do you think that's not possible? Like, I always kind of like wonder here, like we have it. I feel like there's so much money here and everything. I'm kind of like, why are we working
What are we
so
fighting
hard?
about?
What are we fighting about? Can't we all just get along and be mellow? But then I think
Yeah.
you have the other point that it's like, oh, well, if you kind of like if you let your guard down,
Someone
then
else will
some
come and
other
take it.
company will come over or some other country will come
Yeah.
over and take it. You know what I mean? And it's probably
Yeah.
true, but it's just like, why is everyone, like I feel like we're to a point now. I feel like we should be to a point now globally where it's like, can't we all just get along and everyone just have their
Yeah.
own space? You know what I mean? And like,
Yeah. I know. I
mean,
totally
obviously
agree.
it's not possible because you have these people who want to just take over, I guess. But
Yeah.
it's sad.
I mean,
yeah.
you always have the what do you call it? Like, no matter how harmonious a society is, you always have the guy who is standing right behind the benevolent dictator and just shoots him in the back of the head and takes power for himself, right? For every good guy out there, there's like 10 bad guys who want to take over the perfect system and manipulate it to their own ends. And I'm not saying that is like Xi Jinping's ultimate goal or like Putin's ultimate goal. I don't know these people personally. They have their own ideals and beliefs, but I've been reading to review a lot of US perspective books about China. I'm reading one that's coming out relatively shortly, and I'll be writing a review about it on my Substack. And the American point of view is very interesting because the subtitle of the book essentially is how the US will win, the US strategy to win. And the whole book is construed in terms of like China is like the other team, on the field that we're trying to beat. We need to get more points than them, politically, economically, socially. They need to be defeated. We need to like trounce them, all of this kind of language. It's very black and white. There is no perspective about coexistence or mutual benefit or anything like that. As you say, can't we all just get along? I think in an ideal world we could, but unfortunately we don't live in an ideal world. And I think their ideologies are so diametrically opposed. The US has no interest in sort of calling it off with China and being like, let's just be buddies. That's not on their, even within the realms of thought, I believe.
So even coming from the US, like the US doesn't even want to do that. It's like neither side wants to do that. Yeah, it's not only China, it's
competition is
also
like
us.
the US spirit, right? Everything is about competition.
Yeah. It's
the same on a geopolitical level as well.
Which in my mind, this is more like a philosophical thing, but in my mind, I kind of feel like competition is almost a bad thing. Like I was raised like, my dad and like you said, most people in the US are very competitive and they want to win. And it's like, but in my mind, it's kind of like if everybody's battling, if everybody's competing, like you're gonna have the winners and you're gonna have the losers. And it's like, I don't know, like it doesn't seem, and we have that in the US. It's like we have the winners, we have the Elon Musk who are worth 200 billion, and then you have the people on the streets who are poor. And it's like, I don't know. It's like, what's the point? Like, I just don't really want to compete. Like, I'm an artist, I'm a musician, and all this stuff. And it's like, I don't really see the need for competition. And it's like, I guess the idea is like what we were just talking about is like, if we're not competitive as a nation, like you said, some other nation or person or whatever will come in and take it from you. But it's like, and I guess that leads to the question of like, I don't know if you've heard about the whole like globalization thing. It seems like I hear about it more from kind of like the alt-right conspiracy theories than I do from the actual whatever left or whatever. But you know how like I guess the left wants to kind of globalize and like kind of ideally have this idealistic world, like, do you think that's possible to, like, do you kind of see why? I don't really know enough about it to use the right terminology, but you know what I'm
Mhm.
talking about, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
the US, some of the US's goal is to ultimately kind of have a one world government, I guess, right? And globalize. Like, is that
Yes.
true, or do you feel like that's just more like conspiracy theory?
I think I don't think there is a grand gathering. Well, technically there is. I think lots of people say like the Davos conference where all the like super rich people meet and talk about the global future meet is like this grand conference to plan the future of the world without the people of the world having any say in it. I think we definitely see things like that happening. Whether or not it can come together to actually form a one world government, I think there'll always be national, cultural, sort of local interests that push against that. But I think in I mean, like, when you think fast food, everyone has McDonald's, right? If you think about phones, people only have like 3 different makes of phone, and that's pretty much it. And like the operating systems, either Apple or Android, there isn't really anything in between. So we already have monopolies in many areas of our lives that we're very happy to accept. And I think the pandemic as well showed that people are very much more receptive to government dictate than the government even thought that they would be. And so seeing how receptive people are to just, okay, everyone's got to stay at home for like 2 years, and everyone just did it. Right. I don't think the government even knew before that they had the power to do that. But it showed that if you scare people enough about something, then they're much more receptive to kind of being told to do whatever you want. And even though it didn't benefit large parts of the population, if you work remotely in a white collar job, you're fine. But, lots of people lost their livelihoods during the pandemic. Lots of kids lost out on like 2 years of education. Lots of people lost out on healthcare and things like that. So it showed the government as well that people are willing to basically protect their own personal safety and their own well-being and sacrifice pretty much everyone else in the course of like, well, I'm safe sort of thing. So I think the government understands that things like financial incentive and fear, and sort of going back to the idea of competition, it's actually biologically written into our DNA. Even monkeys compete with each other. We can't ever get away from the competition, even if we wanted to. Even in like those communist societies, the communes that people set up, there's quite a few communes in the US actually. There's always one guy in charge. There's always a hierarchy of people who organize things. Otherwise, nothing will get done. So you need hierarchies, and you need job satisfaction. People take satisfaction from the things that they do, and it's not necessarily in competition person to person, but you are competing in terms of like, well, I don't want to be the poorest guy, or I don't want to be a guy on the streets. There's something that you are striving for, and in striving for something, you are already being competitive. So I think all of these factors together kind of contribute to, it's not so much that there is a grand globalist plan, but I think as a population we're kind of walking towards that, because lots of people see that as the ideal, even if they don't know that they're going towards that. It is the ideal for a lot of people who want to live a comfortable life, who want to be relatively wealthy, and who want to, take pride in what they do, essentially.
Yeah, well, I do feel like it's I don't know, like there's a lot of people, I don't know how you look at it, but it's like there's a lot of people like my dad, and I guess probably more like an old, I don't know, like more of a Republican, I guess, type group who doesn't like the idea of globalization. They're like, I like living here in America, and I don't want to, unite with the rest of the world or whatever. But in my mind, if we could get to that point of globalization, and I think there's a lot of like idealism in it, right? Where it's like,
Mhm.
we want this kind of ideal situation. I mean, do you think that's possible? I think that by what you said, it's like, no, it's not, right? Like,
I think it's going back to my answer, the same answer that I gave for communism, right? It's like it removes the human factor.
yeah.
Okay. You have to always account for, like, whenever you're doing the calculation, always carry the one being actual people, and like everything is off. So
Yeah. I mean, I have so many questions, and I could go on and on, but I don't know how much more time do you have?
I actually have to go now.
Okay. Sorry. There was honestly more questions that I had, and I was like trying to like rapid fire through them, but I don't think there's like any way that we will be able to do that. So if you want it, I'll just go ahead and end it on your podcast, and then also so yeah, like once again, plug your podcast, anything that you're doing, but then also any other podcasts, movies, music, TV shows, whatever that you're into, or maybe like people can kind of like watch to learn more about China or whatever.
Mhm. Okay. So my podcast is called Sinobabble. So SINOBABBLE. I also have a Substack newsletter by the same name. I can also find me by the same name on Twitter as well. So in terms of documentaries to watch about China, there's a really good one. I'm just going to Google it really quickly. I'm so sorry because I've forgotten the name.
I know there was one called like or I guess that wasn't China at all, but like American Factory or something like that. That like I think Obama did. I feel like there's one on. Yeah, I don't know. Have you seen that one? I think it's called like American Factory. Obama did it or
Yes.
something.
Yeah. Oh, Ascension. There we go.
Okay.
It's called Ascension. It's a very good documentary. It has no commentary at all, so there's no like narrator telling you what to think. It's just clips from modern life in China. I think it was released like a couple of years ago, and it was made by a Chinese person. It's all just, it's things like people at their factory jobs, people, the mega wealthy, how they spend their life, people training to be butlers for the mega wealthy and their perspectives, people on holiday in China and things like that. So if you know nothing about China and you want to get like, what is it actually like being a Chinese person in China, watch the movie Ascension, and I think that will help people set their perspective when reading news about China. I think that will help a lot.
You know what app it's on or whatever, like what like Netflix or whatever.
Oh, I want to say I'm tempted to say Netflix because everything's on Netflix, but I will double check.
Yeah.
Amazon Prime, apparently. Amazon
Okay,
Prime and
okay.
Paramount Plus. So
Okay, great. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about, life in China, then also technology, then also Maoism. So I guess I'll just have to probably go to your podcast, and I'm sure
Yeah.
you cover all that kind of stuff on your podcast. So
Yes.
okay, great. Thanks for coming on, Eddie. And it was great having you. And I this was one of the topics that I wanted to have, and I've had so many questions on for a while. It was good to have like an expert on it.
Well, it was great to be here. That was a really good chat. I love just like talking about stuff and like getting people's different perspectives on China as well. So it's always great to have these sorts of conversations.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'll send you the link when it's up, and thanks for coming on.
Perfect. Thanks so much for your time.
You too. Bye.
Bye.